Hey guys, so today I want to start our discussion of postmodernism. So if we remember from our previous discussion of modernism, that started in Europe right around the turn of the century and then took a little while to reach the United States. So there was a period of time where the United States was really exploring modernism, exploring abstraction, exploring Dada and all these art movements that came over from Europe. And then when the Great Depression hit, there was a big change in the type of artwork that was being made and a really, really big switch back to realism for a short period of time. And then, of course, we were engaged in World War II, and we really didn't see new artistic movements take hold until after the end of World War II. So the first big movement that came out of postmodernism is one you guys have probably heard of, which is abstract expressionism. So abstract expressionism was a collection of different approaches to abstraction, and this was started in like the late 1940s, but really took hold in the 1950s. And it was the first artistic movement that started in the United States and ended up spreading to the entire world. So this was the movement that really shifted the epicenter of art making from Paris, France, and from Europe in general to New York City in the United States, because all of these artists were living and working in New York City or in that general area. So this was a group of artists who'd actually gone to school together and worked together to a certain extent, and became really interested in what we call the formal qualities of paint. So they were interested in the things that only paint could do. And some of this is a backlash from photography becoming more and more present, and the idea that why bother with realism when that's photography's purview? So photography can do realism better than we ever can. And so we need to see what paint can do that photography can't. And what paint can do is it can show color, it can show texture, it can show spatial relationships. And so the abstract expressionists began to paint in this really pure way, which meant painting without imagery, painting only to evoke some sort of feeling or emotional response, or only to represent their own feelings and emotional responses. And this was a time of something called the real purity of the medium, where you were not supposed to mix mediums. So if you were a sculptor, you didn't paint anything on your sculpture. If you were a painter, you only painted. So there was no mixed media like we see today. The best known of these abstract expressionist artists is this guy right here, Jackson Pollock. And he is really famous for these paintings called drip paintings or action paintings, where he would actually put his unstretched canvas on the floor. So it would just be basically a piece of cloth, but canvas. And he would splatter paint, he would pour paint on it, he'd let things fall on it, he'd let the ashes from his cigarettes fall. He was using house paints and just kind of ordinary paints and not oil paint or acrylic paint. And you end up with these really, really large canvases like this, where you can actually see the movement. So you can see here that he started here and then trailed off down here. So you can actually imagine him making these different movements to make this piece. So that was Pollock. And along with Pollock, in a somewhat similar stylistic manner but different approach, is his wife, Lee Krasner. So Krasner was actually doing these kind of chunky abstract pieces before Pollock, and she really nurtured Pollock for at the sake of her own artwork. So she kind of set aside her artwork to help Pollock become better known, become famous. And she outlived him by quite a few years and continued making abstract work. So she's not painting on the floor the way that Pollock was. She's painting, as far as we know, on a traditional easel or something that is upright. But there's a similar style to their paintings in how The areas of color are fairly small and they're pretty uniformly distributed. So along with these two painters, we have Barnett and Newman. This piece is what's called the zip painting, where there is this line that sort of zips up or zips down through the color. And most of Newman's paintings are like this. They're one solid field of color with a very, very straight line or several very straight lines of different color going through the middle. And you can pretty much identify a Barnett Newman almost immediately upon seeing it. So this was a really unique style that he painted with. So much flatter, much less development of anything other than flat color. So we're really focused on color and shape when we look at Newman's paintings. And then somewhat similar to Newman, but with much more subtle shifts and changes in his paint, is Mark Rothko. So Rothko pioneered what was called color field painting, because you had these large fields of color, large expanses of color. And Rothko would layer his paint over and over and over. So you would have all these little layers peeking out underneath that you could see underneath the main layers of paint. And there is a building in Texas called the Rothko Chapel, which has quite a collection of these very, very dark paintings. And some people who have been there have said it really is a religious experience, whereas others are not impressed by the paintings themselves. So Rothko can really, really depend on how you respond to color and how you respond to the texture of color, because really, other than color and shape and texture, there's nothing else that's being shown here by Rothko. And I don't want to talk about the abstract expressionists without talking about another female artist who I really like, which is Helen Frankenthaler. This is her most famous piece, Mountains and Sea. And she did something called staining her canvas instead of painting in a traditional way with oil paint and a brush. So what she would do is she would actually take unprimed canvas. So most paintings that you see, the canvas has been primed with a couple of layers of white paint. So the paint sits on top of that white canvas or that white paint instead of sinking into it. So this canvas is acting more like a paper towel, where it's not primed and it's just going to absorb the color down inside it. So you have this light staining that happens with Frankenthaler's pieces. She would also paint on the floor like Pollock. She would put these pieces on the floor and pour really thinned paint onto them and have these really subtle colors instead of really strong colors. And along with Frankenthaler was Morris Louis, who also stained unprimed canvas. But he would roll his canvas up and then he would pour the paint down into the funnel that he created by rolling the canvas. So you would get this motion, the captured motion of the paint having been poured down. So getting into the 1960s, our artist Bridget Riley starts to explore how different highlights and shadows and different lines can create optical illusions. So I'm sure if you're looking at this right now, it's waving back and forth. So there's a very strong sense of movement that is literally created in your eye, even though we know that the piece is not actually moving. So Frankenthaler, Riley was interested in how you could trick the eye into thinking that something was moving, or trick the eye into seeing colors as darker or lighter when in reality they were the same. My eyes are still waving. So along with interest in how the eye worked, artists began to be interested in exploring new mediums for making art, such as light and plastics. And we also had a movement called Minimalism. And this piece by Donald Judd is Untitled. And it does not use an actual light source, but it uses translucent panels so that we can see different colors on areas that are not necessarily part of the sculpture. And minimalism is really about making things as simple as possible. So keeping art as clean and simple so that you're only focused on one singular thing. So that if it's a giant cube, like I asked you guys to talk about in your homework, you're really only thinking about the giant cube. You're really only thinking about the metal. You're thinking about the shape of a cube. You're thinking about how much space it takes up and how it looks different when you walk around it from different angles. So minimalism is kind of deceptive because it looks like nothing is going on, but it's actually asking you to really think about a couple of things in a lot of detail. So here we're thinking about the space that this sculpture takes up. We're thinking about how light passes through it. And you have to consider whether or not this orange that's being reflected onto the floor is actually part of the sculpture. So does this piece of floor then become part of the sculpture? You think about arrangement and the linear quality that's created here by these separate pieces. So don't let minimalism trick you into thinking that there's not actually a lot going on. So moving on from minimalism to an art form that we're all much more familiar with, let's talk about Andy Warhol and pop art. So Andy Warhol clearly started pop art. So this is a movement that we really associate with Warhol and with his studio in New York. And his Marilyn Monroe screen prints are some of his most famous pieces, along with his Campbell soup cans, which we've got here. And so the Marilyn pieces are done through screen printing, and Warhol was really interested in printmaking and in printing and in sort of mass production because he started as a graphic designer. So he was really thinking about making images for mass consumption. And his pieces on Marilyn are actually taken from newspapers, magazines, so photos that other artists have taken. He wasn't taking them himself, but he's making them his own by screen printing them and adding his own color. And he's interested in speaking this language of mass culture, this language of consumerism. And he's very cagey. If you ever listen to an interview with him, he basically says his art is just for fun. There's nothing more to it than that. So you have to wonder if he really believed that or if he's actually almost emphasizing how we don't think about things. He's asking you to come to your own conclusions as opposed to just accepting somebody else's words about what the art means or what anything in life means. So he's really interested in pop culture and in mass reproduction and things that we kind of take for granted and things that are ordinary. And you can see that here with his Campbell Soup series. So this series is literally a series of paintings of each Campbell soup can. They are in the exact same space in the painting, so they're composed exactly the same way. The label is facing the same direction. They're all the same size. Even the highlights, if you look on the tops of the cans, are very similar to each other. So he's been using the same lighting and same background, same framing. So he's asking you to look at, again, this consumer-made, mass-produced item. He's mass-producing his paintings. He's making them very generic. There's a sense of sameness. So he's treating his paintings the same way that we treat mass-produced goods, with this kind of repetition. And he is asking you to look at only the label, in a sense, at what is different. What is different is not necessarily the soup that's inside, because we can't see that. What is different is simply the name that's on the outside. So there's a lot more going on in Warhol's pieces than just, a celebration of pop culture. He's really asking you to think about pop culture and things that are now mass manufactured instead of being made by hand. Another artist who's interested in pop culture was Roy Lichtenstein, and what he did was to take panels from comic books and blow them up big enough that you could see the halftone dots. So this is a printing method that was used in newspapers using dots to create, in her skin tone, a lighter shade than what's on her lips and in her fingernails and clothing. So halftone dots was a way of taking just 3 or 4 basic colors and making different colors out of those. And so Lichtenstein is taking material that's already been made, but blowing it up and making a painting of it. So again, kind of talking about the process of printing, the process of making media that's meant for mass consumption. And then we have Claes Oldenburg, and this is Spoonbridge and Cherry. And Oldenburg became famous for making giant sculptures of everyday objects. He's got a giant pair of binoculars, various other giant pieces. And so he's taking these really small, simple items and making them much bigger, much larger than life, making them non-replicatable. So things that you would normally be able to replicate again and again and again. It would be very challenging to replicate one of Oldenburg's sculptures. And it also creates a sense of being in a strange environment because you see this giant object. And of course, they're a lot of fun. Most people really, really like Oldenburg's sculptures and just enjoy seeing ordinary objects that are either very large or very small. So getting into the 1970s, we start to get feminist art, so female artists who are really interested in how women are perceived, how culture talks about women. One of the most famous of these artists is Barbara Kruger. So Kruger is using cutout collage images, so really similar to the Dada artists in that respect. And she's kind of making up her own sayings that go along with these images. So here you could look at this remote control as a piece of chocolate, perhaps controlling a woman or a woman controlling the piece of chocolate. But there's also this kind of subtle undertone that this is a consumer good, this is a mass-produced good made by a company that specifically wants to control consumers into buying it and eating it and then buying more of it. So there is this idea of control, an idea of control of women and control by women that Kruger is letting you kind of bring to this piece without necessarily spoon-feeding you and telling you this is what you should think. Another great feminist artist is the photographer Cindy Sherman. You might have heard of her because she's very famous for dressing up as all kinds of different characters. And her very first series that she's famous for is a series called Film Stills, where she dressed up as these sort of stereotypical women in film. And they're all titled Film Still. They're not actually stills from a movie. They were made specifically just to be photographed, just this one scene. And so she's thinking about women's roles and about stereotyping of women in film at the time and how women are portrayed by dressing herself up. And what I really like as a photographer is that there are a couple of photos where she allows you to see this cord right here. And if you're not a photographer who hasn't worked with large format film, you might not know what this is. But it is a shutter release cable. So this cable is going all the way to her camera. And if she pushes it, she might have it underneath her back so she can roll over onto it. It will take the photo. So if you work with any sort of film photography, which of course she was in the 1970s and which many photographers still do, you have to have a shutter release cable because everything is completely manual. So there's no remote other than this. So she's letting you know that this is a fabricated image occasionally in her photos. So again, in the 1960s, 1970s, there's a big interest in the environment. There are strong environmental movements, and we start to see environmental art. So art that is made in the environment by the environment. Andy Goldsworthy is a really well-known environmental artist who you might have heard of. But this is a piece by Robert Smithson called Spiral Jetty. And it is almost like a dock or a pier built with stone and sand, and this is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. you can still see it if you go there. And essentially it just spirals out into the lake. So giving you a different perspective of the lake. If you walk along it, of course, you would see the lake from a different viewpoint. And actually creating a piece of art that's meant to be viewed from a height or even meant to be viewed from an airplane. So something that you can only see in its entirety from modern technology. So also somewhat reminiscent of the South American land art, where people went and laid out giant, basically line drawings, but with rocks and sand in the desert. So there's also an interest at this time in performance art, and there's still a lot of performance art that's being done. And this is actually a contemporary piece by Marina Abramovic. And it's one that I was able to see myself when I was in New York City many years ago. And it was actually a surprisingly powerful piece. It was a little different to this one, but she sat in the center of a room on a chair at a table in oftentimes a very beautiful dress. And the challenge was that for the entire day, so the entire time that the museum was open, she would sit in complete stillness. She wouldn't move. She wouldn't get up to take a bathroom break. She wouldn't get up to eat. She just sat. And she invited the audience, one by one, to come and sit with her for as long as they would like to. No interaction other than looking in each other's eyes. So when you describe it in words, it sounds kind of hokey. And that's what I expected it to be. We went to this exhibit and went into the room where she was sitting, and I had wanted to sit down and, try it out, and I couldn't because there was a line, and people were sitting and staying so long with her that the line was moving maybe one person every 30 minutes. We would have had to stay all day for me to get a chance to sit, and that just wasn't possible. And what really struck me was the intensity in the room. No one was talking. Everybody was extremely quiet. And there was just this sensation of tension in the room. And I was really, really surprised by how powerful the piece was and the kind of feelings and emotions that it seemed to evoke in everybody who was standing in the room. So performance art can be really, really difficult to understand when you're looking at a photograph or even watching a video. Sometimes you have to be there to get the full extent of it. So we're going to end with conceptual art. We talked about this a little bit when we spoke about the fountain. And conceptual art could be said to start with Joseph Kosuth, where we could go all the way back to the fountain and Marcel Duchamp. But conceptual art is about the concept. It's about the content. It's about the process of you thinking as opposed to how things look. So this is Kosuth's 1 and 3 chairs. And Kosuth was interested in something called semiotics. So semiotics is thinking about how some objects function as symbols and what those symbols mean. And it's something that you might encounter in an advanced English class, but it's also something that you would encounter in an advanced art class. So 1 and 3 chairs is essentially one chair. This is the physical chair. And then the 3 chairs are our physical representation, a photograph, and a definition of a chair. So Kosuth is asking you to think about how a photograph of a chair represents a chair but is not actually a chair. You can't sit in it. And how a definition of a chair doesn't even look like a chair. And reading a definition might give you a very different image of a chair in your head. So you might read the definition of chair and think of the chair that you sit at your kitchen table, or an office chair, or a comfy, overstuffed chair. And so he's thinking about how photographs and how definitions and verbal representations or written representations differ from physical objects. And he's asking you to think about all 3 of these relationships. So conceptual art can go really almost in any direction, and some of it works really well and some of it doesn't. But it's really the majority of what you're going to see if you go into any sort of modern art museum. So the MoMA in New York, you would see a lot of conceptual artwork. So we're going to end there with 1 and 3 chairs. So hopefully you're thinking about 1 and 3 chairs a little bit, about conceptual art. And this is the end of our kind of European and American art history, because it's taken us about up to contemporary times, because we really are still in an era of conceptual art and thinking about concept in our work.